Okay, well, now we're on the module. We're still in ancient history. The next module is modernism, where we have impressionist and move towards contemporary. And after this module, then the last 2 weeks, we're going to be looking at color wheel and some really interesting design elements that I'm looking forward to sharing with you. Now, this module, I need to go back to the the Roman Empire, because early Christianity comes out of that empire, and I just want to touch upon a couple of points that were not included in the last module, that survey. So, in putting this together, revising this PowerPoint, I see this online, and I go, "Oh, this is perfect," because this little timeline here, now you can see some architecture that you're familiar with. And so there you have the ziggurat around 3500 BC, and then you've got the Egyptian pyramids down here, a little bit later. And then you've got over here the Greek Parthenon, which and then up here we're going to begin with talking about the Romans again. This is also a really nice global map where you can see a really ancient civilization in India, and then in China, and you can see where those civilizations started. So the first thing, when you look at this, you should say, well, whoa, there's an Egyptian statue. I recognize that. And you can say, well, she's in a formal stance and she's left foot forward. Well, that happens to be a portrait of Cleopatra, which I've including in this overview because the Roman Empire was 1,000 years, which is quite a long time. And, there are periods that are important, like it really started in around 700 BC, but it wasn't until around 500 that it actually becomes a republic. And then after about 500 years, then in 73 BC, the Spartacus, gladiator, enslaved, caused a slave uprising. And really, it's not until 45 BC that we get the Caesars, the dictators, and of course, very famous is Julius Caesar. And then I just want to include this because Mark Antony, who had a long love affair with Queen Cleopatra from Egypt, and they had 3 children, that occurred, and I won't go into the history of that, but I just wanted you to see, you can identify that sculpture. And it wasn't until 27 BC that you have your first emperors. So I think that's a nice little overview and a little gossip there with Antony and Cleopatra. And the history between them is very interesting, and what happens and why they both took their lives. Now, above me is the first Christian church. It's called Old St. Peter's. It burned down, and then it was rebuilt. And this is some example schematics of this. Here is the floor plan. This is the basilica based on the Greek Parthenon. And this is looking inside this, and this is like a bird's eye view. And we'll talk about that later. So here again, I'm saying, well, so you've got all these activities, uprising, slaves, and then between around 64, and this is the time of Nero, and early 300 AD, Christians are finding themselves in the Colosseums, fighting with the gladiators. Well, they didn't fight, being eaten by lions, torn apart, mutilated, tortured, burned, to amuse spectators. And so, okay, we're looking at 300 AD. Of course, that's after Christ. And now we have early Christianity. And this is occurring. Well, how does that happen? And you will see as we talk briefly about early Christian period, we're going to be looking at the architecture, that there was a period of persecution first where they hid. And then there's a period of recognition. So we're not looking at until the Emperor Constantine converts to Christianity. But something very important happens with Constantine that we'll talk about, because he moves the capital of the Roman Empire to the east, to Istanbul, Turkey, where we just left. So I need to take you there so you can understand how the architecture, some points about these civilizations occurred and those influences. So here's a map of the Roman Empire when it was at its pinnacle. So this tan color, reddish tan, as you look at this, this is when the Roman Empire was at its pinnacle, and it controlled all that land around the Mediterranean Sea. So as you can see, it goes all the way up into Europe, and then as we go all the way over here into the ancient Near East. So this is a lot of organization, and this is a lot of money to maintain this empire and this army, and it is dependent upon taxes, and is dependent upon a very large slave population to maintain this. But Christianity becomes very attractive to the slave population because of what it represents. So you have a lot of conversions, and of course the tenets of Christianity is to help the poor, the sick, and those characteristics that would be very attractive to a slave population. But that just shows you the scale, the size of this empire. And also, this is when you actually you have your first professional army where they pay their soldiers. So this is a very complicated history with a lot of changes. So this is just an overview, and these pictures show you that this is big. This is big. And we didn't talk about this, but I just want to show you this so you can see and understand the magnitude. You see, the Romans could not improve on sculpture because the Greeks, the classical period and the Hellenistic, they were very skilled. So the only thing that the Romans do with sculpture is that their subjects are different. Their subjects are not athletes, but their subjects are warriors, generals rather, generals mostly, and symbols for war campaigns, and orators, because in this period, we're not going to talk about it in this class, you have a lot of changes in philosophy and orators that are going to be important too. So they did things big. Now, the Colosseum that exists today in Rome, Italy, you can see the ruins. This is the ruins that are remaining. There were many Colosseums all over the Roman Empire, but they were small. This one is the largest. And as you look at the text, it can seat 50,000 spectators. The first actual event was a war reenactment on water, a naval reenactment where they actually flooded the base so they could put ships in there. And of course, they're civil engineers, so under this Colosseum, you're going to have chambers where lions and gladiators are housed. So the Romans are civil engineers. And this is amazing because this is the remains of an aqueduct, and how they brought water into Rome, because Rome had millions of citizens that lived there, and to be a citizen, you just need to be in one-day walking distance. They would bring water into Rome with aqueducts, and an aqueduct could be as long as 50 miles, like you see here. And so we would build an aqueduct, close to Raleigh that would look like this. and the water trickles in by gravity, the simple use of gravity as that structure drops in degrees. So that is an example of their civil engineering, and that's one of their major contributions, as well as laws. So I wanted to talk about that briefly, just to show you the magnitude of this civilization, and Christianity comes out of that. Well, the first period before you have the first church is a period of persecution, 33 to 330, where they are actually underground in tunnels. They are creating frescoes in those tunnels, and frescoes are paintings on the wall that are used with a tempera paint. You don't have oil painting until much later, which we'll talk about. And then it's the period of persecution when you have small objects, when you have symbols like the fish symbols. But it's very dangerous to be a Christian during this period. By the time you get to Constantine, the emperor, and Constantine's father persecuted Christians, but Constantine converts. And that's going to be very important. So now you actually have your first piece of architecture, which is Old St. Peter's, and that's what it looked like. And there are some terms here that are still applicable in Christian churches today that I just want to review for you. And this is a simple church that you're going to have, if it's a rectangular floor plan, that's called the basilica, which is like the Parthenon, that rectangular base. This right here, this is in a courtyard, is called an atrium. This is a courtyard. And we have atrium at the mall. Malls have atriums, and that's that center area courtyards where people might be a fountain, or there's people sitting around snacking on benches. So that's an atrium. The nave is right here. So that's the central body of a church. It is not an aisle like in Christian churches they call this an aisle, that center, but actually that's called the nave. And then you have your seating, and on the right, on the ends of the seating, on this left side and right side, that is what were known as the aisle. So that center area when you enter a Christian church and walk down between the pews, that's actually called a nave. And then this is going to be very important later when we just briefly touch upon these amazing cathedrals in the late medieval period. So this is actually the beginning of that, because back here, this structure right there in the back, where this intersects this long area right here, that is called a transept. And in that area, the center, the spot between the transept intersects with the nave. That is where you would have a pulpit, and that is called the apse. And the apse is usually, or the pulpit is located right there, not always in the center, off to the side. And later you'll see there will be a lot of chapels that are located around this area. But this is the beginning. This is the basic floor plan that actually was influenced by the Greek temple, that basilica floor plan. And then this simple structure, as I said, it burned, it was rebuilt, and then it's gone through a lot of reconstructions. So now, here's a piece of sculpture. And the Romans were already into realism. That comes out of the Hellenistic period, when you have a lot of drama and emotion in these sculptures. But the Romans were still, the Greeks, the late Greek period, the Hellenistic, you already see what you would say is more realistic, but they were still highly idealized, very important to the Greeks, certainly the classical and even the Hellenistic. So even there was a lot of drama with Laocoon and that snake that's getting ready to, devour Laocoon and his two sons. And by the way, that was a story about the Trojan War, but I won't go there with that. But even though you have this horrible event, it's still idealized because Laocoon is cut, his sons are cut. So realism is more closely aligned with the Romans because they want, like Sargon, they want you to know what this general looks like, what this emperor looks like. And so now you can connect realism with the ancient Near East, with Sargon, because that was about realism, that metal casted portrait head. So you have some realism here with this early Christian sculpture. But now we're moved to early Christian architecture with Old St. Peter's. We've transitioned into early Christian sculpture. And so it's real simple. What are the subjects of the Egyptian? What are the subjects of the Egyptian sculptures? And you know it's pharaohs, queens, gods, goddesses. The subjects of the Greek classical are what? Athletes, warriors. The subject of the Romans are generals and emperors. The subject, what is going to be the subject of early Christian sculpture? It's real simple. Biblical. Everything is biblical. All through medieval period. 1,000 years, biblical. Stained glass windows, biblical stories. Sarcophagi, tombs, carvings, biblical. Everything either two-dimensional with frescoes or three-dimensional sculptures, biblical subjects. But the skill level has been influenced, obviously, by the Greeks and the Romans. And there's another point you may be interested in. Most of the Roman sculptures are copies of Greek sculptures. So the subject, real simple, is always religious. So this is the Good Shepherd. Yep. That life-size sculpture. And you can also see, if you want to apply some of your art vocabulary, the terminology, that this is an informal, relaxed position. It is not formal. We talked about how the Egyptians, with their formal sculptures, influenced the Greeks in that early period, the archaic period. By classical period, you have contrapposto, a relaxed S-curve or a spine, and you have informal stance like this. Okay, good. Now, this is what's tricky. Constantine, the Roman emperor, moves the capital of the Roman Empire to a place called Byzantium in the Near East, which is Turkey today. I do not know why he did that. I don't know. Historians give a lot of different reasons. So when he does that, you see, when you look at the Sumerians, you could see their works were different. The Assyrians, I mean, it's very abstracted. Where the West, with the Greeks and the Romans, I'm talking about Rome in Italy, the West, was always representational, moving towards realism, which is high realism, is called verism. And so he moves the capital to, he's a Christian, to the ancient Near East, Byzantium, and he changes the name to Constantinople, which that is a name today in Turkey. Now, that becomes Eastern Orthodox Christianity. The West in Rome, where the Pope lives, is Western Christianity. That is in Latin. They speak in Latin, where in the Eastern Orthodox it is Greek. And we do have a Greek Orthodox church here. It's up in Haymont on Oak Ridge Road, and inside that church you have images that look like this. So this is from, I'm going to show you that architecture, which will be on the wall. And as you can see, they're more abstracted. They're less realistic. This is actually the queen, the empress, and this is Theodora, and then she has the attendants around her, which are the apostles. The West would never do that. They would not do that. But again, this is the Roman Empire, and it's important to connect themselves because of the power with the apostles. Also, by the time this happens, the West falls to the barbarians and is pretty much leveled, while the Eastern Orthodox Christianity flourishes. Then the West goes through the medieval period and has to rebuild. Okay? Now, this is Hagia Sophia that was built. This is in Turkey, and this is built by the Roman Emperor Justinian. And you can see a lot of characteristics here, like here is the Roman dome. These pyres were built later, much later in its history. But you'll also see, you'll learn later that these are flying buttresses when we look at the Gothic. And so this is an extraordinary piece of architecture. And the image that I showed you previously with Queen Theodora, she is in that structure on the wall. But this is what the inside is similar to, which I didn't show you. This is the Roman Pantheon that you studied. And this is that facade that looks on the front that looks like a Greek temple. But here was this structure in the back that I didn't really talk about, the silo looking thing. I said that the Greeks were civil engineers. The Romans are civil engineers. They developed the arch principle, and that is a dome, as well as the reason that aqueduct can run for 50 miles is because of the arch principle, which is weight is distributed to the sides in an arch. Where this is post and lintel, so all these structures before the Romans was post and lintel, where you just use gravity. This is this vertical column, these columns, that sits on top. Okay? But this image is what's inside this structure, this Roman Pantheon, that you didn't see in the last module. So as you look at this, and you can see all the Greek influences, there's a different columns, there's a Corinthian. They're going to take that and apply it here. So this is Hagia Sophia, and this is the interior structure. Okay? It's pretty amazing. All right. We're going to actually go into a little bit, medieval Europe is 1,000 years. We need to get to contemporary art. So I'm just talking about really some significant architecture in this period. So the Byzantine Empire, which I just spoke of, which is the early, Eastern Orthodox Christianity, that continues. But see, when Constantine split the empire, it's hard to maintain an empire with so much geography, and so that falls to the barbarians. And let me just say this, because I didn't mention it with the early Christians. You see, the Romans didn't care if you pulled a rabbit out of a hat on a street corner and called that your faith. There were many, 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 many faiths, religions, mystics in Rome. Christianity was just one of many, 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 because by the time you get to the Roman Empire, it becomes much more global, international, because of the trade routes. The early Christians paid their taxes, and that was important, because the Roman emperors wanted two basic things: pay your taxes to keep this military machine happening, but you also need to say that the emperor is God, is related. So if you pull a rabbit out of a hat on a street corner and you call that a faith, and then you have no problem with saying that you also believe that the emperor is part God, then okay. But the early Christians couldn't do that, obviously, because there's only one God. And we don't in this course talk about it, but of course early Christian art comes out of from the Hebrews and their history. Yeah, Jewish history, because Jesus was a Jew. So this idea of the Hebrews and monotheism, you get Christianity, and the early Christians just could not say they believed that emperor was God. And so that's when they find themselves in the Colosseums, and they're also scapegoats for other reasons. So thank you, Constantine, for converting. The reason he did, by the way, were basically political reasons, but that doesn't matter. So the Western Christianity, where Rome is, just think of the Pope, is going to fall, and it has literally leveled. Those northern tribes are coming down and conquering and leveling Vikings and others, and they have to rebuild. So then you go through that long period of rebuilding, and all we want to talk about in this course is, let's look at some architecture. And the last two periods before we get to, and it's not in this this PowerPoint, the next PowerPoint, I separated them, is going to be the Renaissance and the Baroque. Because there's some really important points in that. So the Romanesque, first you have the migratory period, and then you have a lot of migration, and you have a lot of Christian empires like the Ottoman, etc. But you don't really start building these cathedrals until the Romanesque period, Roman-like, and then the Gothic, which is the pinnacle of the medieval period, and then they transition into the Renaissance, which is the rebirth of humanities, and it's going to look Greek again because they copied the Greeks. So during the medieval period, for 1,000 years, you don't see an undraped figure like you did with the Greeks. You wouldn't see that. It's not until the Renaissance. And the subject will be religious, like Michelangelo's David, who is undraped. So I want to just briefly talk about these characteristics and the rise of the cathedral. And you should be able to compare the two, and you can see how it develops. And so here is a list of that comparison. Like anything, it starts off a simple form, and then, or a structure, and then it gets more elaborate. Right? Makes sense. So I'm just going to go now to the Romanesque structure, which is a church, or you could call it a cathedral. And you can see that it's, well, you can't really see this until you compare the two. But you've got geometric groupings, like here is like rectangular form. This is cylinder right here, pyramidal, a conical, right? And you also have these windows that are like arched. That's the Roman arch, like the aqueducts, right? So that's why it's called Romanesque, which was derogatory, by the way, when that name came to be. And the exterior is very plain, like the Pantheon and even Hagia Sophia, but the interior is very elaborate, like I showed you with those other two structures. So we could say in comparison, this is a little blocky, limited windows. And lastly, in this PowerPoint, we come to the medieval period. We have been in Europe talking about these cathedrals, and we are in the Gothic period, and this is Notre Dame in France. So it becomes very, very elaborate, and depending on the location of the region, like in Milan, they were crazy, amazing, decorative. Crazy. The English, more staid. The English cathedrals were not very elaborate. And so this is sort of a middle ground, this the Notre Dame. And so it's the same thing. Now, if you will think back to that picture of Old St. Peter's, there's the nave, okay, right here. And this you would say is the transom, these two like tower things here, all right? And you've got many, many, many windows. And the idea behind this period, the Gothic period, when you have the pointed arch, that's how you know it's Gothic. Now, some cathedrals did mix the two. And so when you go around in Fayetteville, you'll see, and there's a Gothic cathedral on the campus of Duke University. Downtown, there's sort of a Gothic church. And depends on how large it is, like the Methodist church in downtown Fayetteville is more Romanesque than Gothic, as I recall. But there's going to be Gothic influences. So if you are Christian and go to a smaller church and you have a spire, well, that is going to be Gothic influence. These spires, these pointed spires that you'll have a lot of times, cupola on top or a cross or something. The idea in the Gothic is they're building them larger and larger, and the idea is get higher and higher and higher to God. And let's impress each other. Let's the French in this city impress this city. It takes 30 years to build these. This is carved stone. And so you have many windows, and that's when you have a lot of stained glass, that light coming through the windows. The stories of the stained glass, of course, are biblical, like I said. Very elaborate. This kind of rose, it's called rose window. This surface, this carved relief is actually called, and you have it on other structures. These carvings are called tracery. And that is a round window is called rose window. Plain you can see a lot of pointed arches. So the difference is with the Romanesque, it was plain inside, plain outside. I'm not going to do this video again. Elaborate inside. With the Gothic, it's elaborate outside, elaborate inside. So this has a very elaborate inside. And the reason, lastly, as I wind this up or come to a close, is the reason they can go so high is because of these like spider legs looking structures coming away from the building. Those are called flying buttresses, and they are, and they are supports. A buttress is a support. So those are some, vocabulary for you to know and apply. And that's where